Hello, I'm Kerr. Welcome to my art studio. This week we're going to have a look at watercolour palettes. Now there are so many palettes on the market, it's an absolute minefield out there. So I'm going to give you a few ideas that you might like to think about when you're choosing a palette. And I'll also give you lots of hints and tips about using and looking after your palette. So, are you ready? So today we're going to have a look at palettes, and we're going to look at the things to consider when choosing a palette, and we're going to look at the most efficient way of using our palettes. I'll also show you how to clean off any permanent stains that you have. And I'll also show you how to stop your palettes from beading up when you do your mixing. So the different sorts of palettes that you can buy really come into three categories. You've got ceramic palettes, you've got plastic palettes, and you've got ones that are made of metal. So those are really the only versions of it that you can buy, and there are hundreds and hundreds of different designs of palettes. So you might think, well, how do I choose a palette? Well, I think the best thing to think about when you choose a palette is, first of all, you think about what it is that you're going to be painting, and the most important thing is you think about your brushes. Now, why do I say that? Well, if you look at our little ceramic palette here, now there is very little point in putting paint into here and then trying to use a big wash brush to mix up some washes in a little palette like that. It'll be totally useless. Now, yes, I've got a little palette like this, but I use it when I use my inks. And I put inks into here because I only need a very small amount of ink, and this is perfect for that. But the idea of using a brush this size, or this size, with a palette like this, would be setting you up to fail. So think about the brushes that you're going to be using. If you only ever use little brushes and you do small paintings, then yeah, this palette will be absolutely perfect. So the brushes are very, very important when you come to choose a palette. The same thing with this one. If I was using my big wash brush, I would have an awful job trying to mix up a wash in here with a big brush like this. If I was doing a big painting where I need to have big wet washes, I would probably go over to this palette, where I can put some paints around the side, and then I can drop my paints into the well, squirt in some water, and I can get a really big, loose, watery wash if I want it, and it's confined within that little pan. Also, when you're choosing a palette, it depends whether you're going to be working at home with the palette sitting on the table, or are you going to be standing to paint, or maybe giving a painting demonstration? But if you're standing, then you need to have a palette that you can hold like this. Now the idea of this palette is that although it's quite heavy, it's metal, the weight of the palette is on your arm. If I should turn this around the other way, and I have actually seen a professional artist holding their palette like this, which is, I don't know how they managed it because it's totally top heavy. If you turn it round like this, all the weight is down here. So the idea of having the thumb space is to keep the palette with the weight resting on your arm. And then you can stand and paint, and you're not going to be straining your wrist or straining your hand. And also, your fingers are free here, so you can hold your brushes. So that's the idea of the little place there to put your thumb. But As I said, if you're working at home and you've got your palette sitting on the table next to you, there's no need for that. Now let's have a look at the way that I organise my palette. I don't know whether you can notice here, but I keep the colours opposite. I mix the colours as much as I can opposite where they're stored in the little pans. So my greens I will mix here, my yellows I'll mix here, my reds here and my blues here. And you might think, well, why do you do that? Well, if I've had a blue here that's very staining, for example, phthalo blue is very, very staining, and we're going to use that in a minute to make some stains so we can clean them off afterwards. If I've got a big blue stain on my palette here that I can't get rid of, if I then take some yellow paint and mix it on top of my blue stain, it's going to look green. So it's going to really confuse me when I do my mixes. So as much as I possibly can, I mix my colours in the same areas every time. Obviously it's not possible with every colour you mix. I mean, that would be ridiculous to think you could do that. But as much as I can, I will keep the blues in this area, the reds in that area, the yellows and the greens, and it really works. And this area up here, I keep empty, and I use that for my big brushes. I've got plenty of space here to mix my paint. When I'm in the studio, I will also use my big plastic palette for doing mixes, but if I'm out and about and I'm painting out of doors or giving a demonstration, I haven't got this one. I've only got this with me, so that's where this big area comes in really useful for my big brushes. And if I have any paint left over after I've done some mixes, I don't clean it off, that's a waste. You just leave it there, re-wet it, reconstitute it, and you can just use it again. So that's my big brush area. Now you might say, well, why are there 2 extra pans in here? Well, one of the reasons is I did run out of space at one time. I know I've got an empty one here, but I did run out of space at one time. So I glued in 2 little pans. But that's not the main reason they're there. The main reason is these are my 2 opaque colours. That's Naples yellow and that's lemon yellow. That's very opaque and that's fairly opaque. And I don't really want them sitting too close to my other colours so that the colour can creep over into the other colours and start making them cloudy. So I put them there to remind myself that those are opaque and not to get them mixed up with the other colours. But that's just something that I do. You don't have to do that. I'm not a great lover of opaque colours. These are the only opaque colours that I've got, really, and it just reminds me. Now another thing you might notice on here, with the pans, these are whole pans, by the way. You can get little half pans as well. There's a little half pan. These are whole pans, and obviously they've got a little wall all the way around them. So when you mix your paint, or when you get your paint, you have to lift it out of the pan. But with these slanted wells, you can slide your paint out because there's no wall here. And I can actually get my big brush into these because there's no little edge here to start rubbing the paint off. So I can slide my paint out with my big brush. Another reason that I love these slanted pans rather than the continual wall around them. Now sometimes people use a little bit of white gouache to make highlights on their paintings. Now a big tip is do not put your white gouache in your watercolour box, because when you go to clean off the gouache, you're going to get little bits of it getting trapped in the edges here. You might not think there's any there, but little bits will creep out into the edge. And then the next time you do your watercolour mixes, some of that white gouache will creep into your mixes and it'll make them cloudy. So if you want to use white gouache, Get a little piece of plastic card and just squeeze your white gouache onto that. Use it however you want, and then you can just wash the plastic off afterwards. Or you could use the top of a little of a little jam jar, or sometimes I put a strip of masking tape next to my painting and I just squeeze my white gouache onto the masking tape and just take it off from there. Do not put it in your palette. Another little hint about paints: some manufacturers make paints that contain honey. Now, the advantage of paints that contain honey is that they don't completely dry hard like this. They stay a little bit moist, which is lovely, except if you close your palette up like that and you leave it like that for some time, or you travel around with it, as I do, the next time you open your palette, you'll find that your paints have slid. Because they're not hard and dry, they're still a bit moist and they will slide. And you will find that some of the colours have landed on top of other colours and your palette ends up in a dreadful mess. So paints that contain honey are brilliant if you're working at home, but they're really not much good for travelling. Don't ask me how I know that. I used them once when I went travelling with my paint box. I opened it up and everything had slid all over the place and I had such a mess and most of my paints were ruined. So think about that. When you finish doing a painting session, don't do that. Why? Well, if you let your paints dry out before you close the lid and leave them in the open air, you're less likely to get mould forming. But if you close your palette up when it's damp, and it's dark in there now, so damp, dark conditions are perfect for mould growing. And if you don't use your palette for several weeks and you open it up, you will find you've got mould growing. So always allow your palette to dry in the open air. Okay, so how do we clean our palettes? Well, the obvious way is with a cloth or a tissue, and you just wipe it out. The wonderful thing about watercolour is there's hardly any clearing up. Now you will get little bits stuck around the edges. So the best way to get those out is to get an old hog hair brush that you don't use very much. Keep it for cleaning. You don't want to be using it for painting and cleaning. And just dip it in some water and wriggle that around into the corners and you will get out all the odd bits of paint. I've never understood why people have dirty palettes. You know, they don't have to be scrupulously clean every time. And like this, if you've got some paint squeezed out into your palette, don't go and clean that off. That's a waste. But clean off anything that you think you're not going to use again, and this will get you into the corners. Now, I'm not going to clean these off because I know these colours are colours I use quite often. So next time I'm painting, I will just come along with some water and I'll just re-wet that, and there I've got my red that I can use again. So never clean colours off that you think you're going to be reusing. It's just wasting money. Now I'm going to show you how to clean off some permanent stains on palettes, and we're going to do it on a ceramic palette, a plastic palette and a metal palette. Now one of the most staining colours of all is phthalo blue, and I don't use it very often because I'm not keen on staining colours. It's a beautiful colour on its own, but I don't like the fact that it stains my watercolour paper. And because I like to lift paint as one of my techniques when I'm painting, if I've got a staining colour, then it's going to stain my watercolour paper, and I don't like that. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up the phthalo blue, And then we're going to leave it to go dry, so that you can see that I haven't just wiped it off straight away to make it look easy. We're going to leave it to dry, and then we'll come back when the palette will be stained quite badly, and then I'll show you how to clean it off. It's like magic. And then after that, I will show you what to do to stop your paint from what we call beading up when you mix it on your palette. It happens very much when you have a new palette. You start to mix your paint and it goes into lots of little bobbles all over the place. So I'll show you how to get around that. Okay, so we've got phthalo blue on our metal palette, our ceramic palette and our plastic palette. I'll let those dry and then we'll come back and clean them off. Right, so all the phthalo blues are now dry. Let's have a go at clearing them off. First of all, we'll do the ceramic one. As you can see, no problem whatsoever. You can get all the phthalo blue off with just a wipe of a tissue. So no staining whatsoever in the ceramic palette. These are lovely to have in the studio or at home, but they're pretty heavy to be carrying around with you. Right, now let's have a look at the metal one. Now you can see the strong stain there left behind by the phthalo blue. I'm going to use a little, you can even see it's on my fingers, look. I'm going to use a little cotton pad, clean cotton pad, which I'm going to make wet. And then I'll wipe it over again to make sure that I've got everything off that I can. So I can't get any more off there. Okay, so that's as much as I can get off that palette. Let's do the same with the plastic one. Now I'll do what I did before. I'll take a clean cotton pad, make that wet, and then I'll check that I've got everything. A little tiny bit there, but not much. Okay. Right, so we've got two quite badly stained palettes. Now this is where the magic comes in. And maybe I ought to become a member of the magic circle. Because I'm going to use ordinary everyday toothpaste, which I'm going to put on the stains with a clean pad. Make it wet, squeeze out the water. I'll do this one first. Look, how easy is that? And as you saw before, there's no way I could have got that off with just water. Now this is ordinary toothpaste. It doesn't matter what brand of toothpaste you use, look. And because toothpaste is mildly abrasive, what it's doing is it's just stripping off that top layer of paint. Look at that. So just a little bit of ordinary everyday toothpaste. So let's do exactly the same thing with the metal one. Make my little cotton pad wet, squeeze out the water. And you can see how easily that comes off. Now, because toothpaste is mildly abrasive, you have to be careful not to do this too often on your metal palettes. It doesn't matter on the plastic one because plastic is the same all the way through. But with the metal one, you've got a layer of enamel here. And after a while, if you do this too often, the enamel will get thinner and thinner and thinner, and eventually you'll wear a hole in it. So this is not something to be done every day. But if you do have any really bad stains and you really do want to get rid of them, then by all means use the toothpaste. Look at that. As I said, I can become a member of the magic circle. Now you see it, now you don't. Now there will be lots of other things that you can use to clean your palette that are mildly abrasive. There'll be household liquids that you can get, spray bottles and that sort of thing. Yeah, if they're slightly abrasive, they will work. But this is just so easy. And also, you don't need to take your palette to the dentist because it'll never get any fillings because you've used a proper toothpaste. Stop being silly, Anne. Do you sometimes find when you have a new palette that when you try and mix your paint, it beads up and it doesn't mix properly? Let me show you. Can you see how it's going into lots of little globules and you can't get a nice smooth mix of paint? Well, this is where the wonderful magic toothpaste comes into its own. Let's put some toothpaste onto the palette and we'll give it a jolly good rub. As I mentioned before, toothpaste is very slightly abrasive and it will scratch very gently the surface of your palette. You probably won't notice the scratch marks, but they are there. The palette will no longer look polished and shiny, it'll take on a matte effect, and that's what you want. Take the toothpaste off. Extra little polish just to make sure it's all gone. Palette smells wonderful, by the way. Now let's try that again. There we are. See the difference? No beading up like you've got here. And the more you use your palette, the more you'll find that you'll get this effect. But to get it started, just give it a quick rub with anything slightly abrasive. But the easiest and quickest thing to use is good old toothpaste. We know there are hundreds and hundreds of different types of palette out there on the market. And to be honest, you don't have to spend a lot of money. The plastic palettes, which are very cheap, are absolutely fine. You can also use an ordinary white dinner plate. Most people have got a white plate in the house somewhere, and they're perfectly good to use for a palette, especially if you're using big brushes. But do consider having more than one palette. I've got a little palette like this that I use if I'm using inks or I'm using small brushes, but I've also got great big white plastic trays that I use at other times. So don't just think that one palette is good enough for everything. Sometimes more than one is very, very useful. And if you found this video useful, then consider clicking that subscribe button and that little bell icon, because that lets you know when I upload another video for you. If you've enjoyed this one, then give it a thumbs up. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Now remember, There is an artist in everyone. Goodbye for now.